My name is Pastor Jeff Johnson. I'm the pastor at University Lutheran Chapel in Berkeley, and it's a privilege to be present with you this morning. I was at the early service, and we'll be at the late service. I guess that starts at about 10:45, so yes. We're constrained on the amount of time that we can have, which is a good thing for me because I can talk a lot about different things. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk together about some things. I understand that you're in the middle of a series and that you're taking a look at a number of different issues around welcoming LGBT people in the congregation, the place of LGBT people in the society and in our world, and looking also at some of our sacred texts which have on occasion and often in our church been used to justify a type of exclusion that we have practiced as Lutherans and as Lutheran Christians. So this morning we want to, I guess last week you looked at the Levitical texts, is that true?
Just a little bit.
A little bit, okay, all right.
Last week we looked at the text that we don't follow through on. Why we follow through on some, we'll look at those later.
Nice, fantastic.
But we talked about all the things that, are in Leviticus that we don't do.
Okay, all right. Well, that's very good. That's very good. I was checking my my coat to see what fabrics were mixed in my material. So I'm prepared this morning to do a little speaking with you about the text in the book of Romans, if we want to do that, or we could just talk together. But I'll start off with the Romans text, and we can see where this goes. As we get started, I wanted just to make a quick point about how strange our sacred texts can be. I'm not sure we always realize this, but the Bible, the Old and the New Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, and those Scriptures which were written in Greek, come out of a different era. People thought differently, the world was constructed differently. We try to make them perfectly applicable to our day and age, but they're not. It's hard to do that. They're very strange. It came home to me last Wednesday when I gathered with our confirmation students. We have a joint confirmation program in Berkeley. We gathered with our confirmation students to take up the Noah text, the flood text. And we all know this story, right? We all know the story of Noah, the flood, the ark, the animals, the rainbow, the promise. So we read it with the kids, and I was reminded of some really strange parts of that story that I always forget. So I just wanted to start this morning with that because it's important for us, I think, as we go into this, to realize that these texts come out of different worlds, not our world, but different worlds. So this is how the Noah story begins. And I'm reading from the Contemporary English Version, which makes this more apparent, I think, than the New Revised Standard Version. But there's a line that says that Noah was 500 years old, which the kids loved, right? They were kind of amazed that people lived to be hundreds of years old back in that time, and said that he's the father of Sheth. He has 3 kids, 3 sons. and then you have these verses. More and more people were born in the world, until finally they spread all over the earth. Some of their daughters were so beautiful that supernatural beings came down and married the ones they wanted. Then the Lord said, "I won't let my life-giving breath remain in anyone forever. No one will live for more than 120 years." And the children of the supernatural beings who had married these beautiful women became famous heroes and warriors. They were called Nephilim and lived on the earth at that time and even later. How many of you remember the Nephilim when you're telling the story of Noah and the ark and the rainbow and the promise? I always forget that, right? In the NRSV, the supernatural beings are called sons of God, but we don't really hear it, right? When we hear sons of God, we don't really hear it for what. So these are strange texts, some of them that we have to deal with. I just want to read one more. This is from Numbers 14. You know, a lot of the texts that we use around the homosexuality texts, or the texts that get used around the inclusion of gay and lesbian people, talk about punishment. Some of them even talk about death penalty. stuff, right? There are some Levitical laws that talk about the death penalty. So there's this fascinating text in the book of Numbers, which we all read, right? The book of Numbers, it's by our bed, it's nightly reading, it's devotional, right? The book of Numbers. So here, the book of Numbers chapter 14, verses 32 through 41. This is from the NRSV. When the Israelites were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath. Those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses, Aaron, and the whole congregation, and they put him in custody because it was not clear what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, "The man shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him outside the camp." The whole congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death, just as the Lord had commanded Moses, because he was gathering sticks on the Sabbath. Do we understand this world? So we really have to be careful the way we look at these strange texts. They come from a world that we don't really get anymore. And we don't understand kind of what moves people through this world. So I want to talk next, just before we get into the Romans text, a little bit about interpretation. Because if we recognize that this world is strange, that the text comes out of a strange, it says strange things sometimes. Interpretation is everything, and we need a little bit of distance in interpreting these texts. We can't press them, as Christopher Stendhal has said, too hard for meaning, lest we make the texts say things that they don't want to say. So I have a couple of videos, and we're going to start with one about different ways that we can interpret the text. I'm sure most of us won't agree with Cindy Jacobs, but she has an interesting way of interpreting Scripture in general. Listen to Cindy.
According to biblical principles, a marriage is between a man and a woman. So we have to say, what happens when a nation makes a decision that is against God's principles? Well, often what happens is the nature itself will begin to talk to us. For instance, violent storms, flooding. And you know, there are actually some patterns that you can see where a nation will make a decision that is contrary to the principles of God, and after that, there is some kind of answer that God gives, being the God of creation, the God who created nature, but we don't always understand what he's saying.
This is my favorite part.
Well, there's something interesting we have been watching. Let's talk about this Arkansas pattern and say, could it be a pattern? We're going to watch and see. But the blackbirds fell to the ground in Beebe, Arkansas. Well, the governor of Arkansas's name is Beebe. And also, there was something put out of Arkansas called Don't Ask, Don't Tell by a former governor. This was proposed Bill Clinton. And so, could there be a connection between this passage we're set, and now that we had the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where people now, legally in the United States, have broken restraints with the Scripture? Because the Scripture says in Romans 1 that homosexuality is not allowed. It could be because we have said it's okay for people who commit these kind of acts to be recognized. You know, in our military, for the first time in our history, there is a...
You get the picture, right? So you understand our argument. The blackbirds fall from the sky because they fall from the sky in Beebe, Arkansas, because Bill Clinton was from Arkansas. And because Bill Clinton instituted Don't Ask, Don't Tell, we've repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell. That's in violation of the scriptural prohibition in Romans 1. Sorry. In Romans 1, and God is responding. It's possible to interpret the Scripture in this way, right? It's possible to read the Scripture as a guidebook for the way in which we should punish each other, or as a list of instructions that we need to carefully follow so as to avoid God's punishment against us or against creation like the blackbirds. This is what usually happens with our text this morning, Romans 1. So I want to just talk a little bit about how Romans 1 is usually interpreted. Then I want to do another quick video with another modern day biblical interpreter, and then we'll get into the text. So, Bill Countryman, who has written this fantastic book, if you don't have it, go get it. It's a couple years old now, but it's great. Dirt, Greed, and Sex. He talks about all of these matters. He's an Episcopal professor at the Episcopal School in Berkeley. Fantastic person. He says this about Romans 1. The usual modern interpretation of this passage, the passage which she quoted, understands Paul to be saying that God, as punishment for the sin of idolatry, she says the sin of homosexuality, but the sin of idolatry has abandoned the Gentiles to another sin, homosexual acts. And in addition, as punishment for this error, God has inflicted on Gentile males some further unspecified recompense. Some people would say sexually transmitted disease. Some people have said AIDS, right, is the unspecified recompense. Homosexual acts are part of a larger group of characteristically Gentile sins, all of which deserve death, like the man gathering sticks. Right, so this is the traditional interpretation of the Romans text that we're going to take up and that we're going to challenge this morning by looking a little bit more specifically at the text itself. And this interpretation rests on this fundamental connection between homosexuality and sin. So listen to another modern day interpreter. This is Joel Osteen. Maybe some of you saw him. He was on Piers Morgan, the new kind of evening talk show on, is it CNN? CNN. Yeah, on CNN. And he helps to make this connection. We'll just listen to a little bit.
One of the moral mazes for any preacher, I think, a Christian preacher in particular, is homosexuality. And there's been lots of coverage in the news recently, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell campaign, obviously. What is your view? Because it seems to have changed depending on the interview that I've read or seen. What is your, is homosexuality a sin in your eyes?
Yes, I've always believed, Pierce, the scripture shows that it's a sin. But, you know, I'm not one of those that are out there to bash homosexuals and tell them that they're terrible people and all that. I mean, there are other sins in the Bible, too. I think sometimes the church, and I don't mean this critically, but we focus on one issue or two issues, and there's plenty of other ones. So I don't believe homosexuality is God's best for a person's life. I mean, sin means to miss the mark. But I don't believe being prideful or being, you know, lying.
You don't normally talk about
so
sin.
we'll stop it.
That's the first time I've actually heard you spend.
This is the entire interview is well worth listening to because he goes on at length talking about this, and you can't find fault with him. He's very nice, this interpreter. He says some things in a very, very nice way. Not everybody does that, right? Not all of the people who interpret Scripture in exactly the same way that he does do it as nicely. I don't know if you saw reports recently about the situation in Uganda, where the young man David Kato was bludgeoned this past week. He's an openly gay activist. His picture and name were on the front page of a tabloid called Rolling Stone. It's not the Rolling Stone we know. It's a smaller Ugandan publication. But his picture and name were on there, and there was the title, Hang Them. And it was a list of all the openly gay activists in the country. It's illegal in Uganda to be gay. Illegal. And they're considering now in the legislature a bill to propose the death penalty for openly gay and lesbian people. So this headline, hang him or hang them, wasn't out of context. It was in context. The campaign to pass this bill is being sponsored by 3-4 evangelical preachers from this country. They're raising the money, and they're sponsoring the campaign that is promoting this kind of reaction. So not everyone who has this perspective speaks as nicely as does Joel Osteen. But the idea is the same idea. And it's an idea which fuels the kind of hatred which we saw this past